Now let's start with today's story. Melissa paced around the living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke to her best friend, Linda. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I've been thinking about it for a while now, Melissa said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Tonight's the night. When Jim gets home, I'm going to sit him down, give him his favorite meal, crack open a beer, and just tell him, I want more fun in my life, Linda, and I'm going to get it. Linda's laughter rang warmly through the speaker. That's what I'm talking about, she said with enthusiasm. Melissa, you're finally stepping up as a brave, independent woman. You're taking charge of your life and getting your hands on what you want. A smile tugged at Melissa's lips. Exactly. I mean, Jim's a great guy, but I need more than just vanilla, you know? Life's too short. Linda's tone turned knowing. I completely get it. When I opened things up with Mark last year, it was a mess at first. What happened? Melissa asked curiously, leaning against the kitchen counter. He didn't want to hear it, Linda said bluntly. Tried to say no like it was his decision alone. She paused dramatically. So, I told him flat out, either we do this or we get divorced. I wasn't bluffing. Melissa's breath caught. What did he do? Linda let out a satisfied sigh. He got in line. Melissa chuckled nervously. You really gave Mark an ultimatum like that? That sounds bold. Linda's tone turned proud. Damn right I did. We're not living in the 1950s anymore, Melissa. We're liberal women. We know what we want, and we're not afraid to go after it. Exactly, Melissa agreed, her confidence building. It's not like I'm saying I don't love Jim. I just want more freedom, you know? It's about living life on my own terms. That's the mindset, Linda encouraged. Look at Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith. Everyone talks about them like they're crazy, but honestly, they're just ahead of the curve. Jada stood her ground, lived her truth, and Will? He figured it out. They're still together because they're honest with each other. Melissa nodded, even though Linda couldn't see her. I always admired that about them. They didn't let society tell them how to live their marriage. They made it work in their own way. Exactly. People are so judgmental about open relationships because they're stuck in these old ideas about marriage, Linda said with a hint of disdain. But guess what? We're redefining it. Women like us, we're not settling for boring lives or outdated rules. Melissa felt a spark of energy surge through her. You're right. I want to have fun, experience life, and be true to myself. And tonight, Jim's going to hear exactly how I feel. I'll give him his favorite meal and a beer, and we'll talk like adults. Linda's voice softened but remained firm. Good. Be clear, be confident, and remember, you're doing this because you're worth it. And if he says no? Melissa asked, uncertainty creeping in. Linda didn't hesitate. Then you do what I did. You make it clear that it's either your happiness or his comfort. Mark didn't like it at first either, but you know what? Melissa's voice lowered. What? He got in line, Linda said smugly. Melissa exhaled deeply, stretching her legs out on the couch, the phone still pressed to her ear. I just need to remember to be strong, right? She said, seeking reassurance from Linda. He's not going to like it, but I have to be forceful. Exactly, Linda affirmed confidently. Don't back down, no matter what. You've got this. Melissa nodded to herself. I remember. Just like we discussed. He doesn't have a choice. This is how it's going to be. And if he really loves me, he'll let me do this for my happiness. Correct, Linda emphasized. But be ready. There will be yelling and screaming. He'll try to fight it, sure, but it's just a tantrum. Stay calm but firm. Let him vent. Once he's done, he'll realize you're in charge. Melissa smiled faintly. Right. Besides, as far as he'll know, this is only temporary. Once he comes to accept it, he'll probably even like it. Then everything can just continue. Her voice faltered slightly. Are you sure about all this? Men can be pretty stubborn. Linda's voice took on a reassuring tone. Look, Melissa, Jim loves you more than anything. He'll be pissed at first, sure, but after he calms down, he'll realize that he loves you so much he'll do anything to make you happy. Even this. Melissa hesitated. Okay, you're the expert, I guess. Linda chuckled confidently. Trust me. It took me screwing up 2 marriages to figure all this out, but I perfected the method on my 3rd. Melissa's eyebrows lifted in surprise. You perfected it? Absolutely, Linda said smugly. Mark, my current husband? Completely under my control now. He even stands beside the bed while I'm enjoying one of my lovers. Melissa gasped softly. No way. Linda's tone was matter of fact. In a month or 2, Jim will fall in line too. Then you'll have the best of both worlds. the security of your marriage, and the enjoyment of several other men. Melissa leaned back further into the couch, processing Linda's bold confidence. You make it sound so easy, she said with a nervous laugh. It's all about mindset, Melissa, Linda assured her. Stay strong, be firm, and don't doubt yourself. Remember, you deserve to be happy on your terms. Melissa smiled faintly. Thanks for being in my corner, Linda. I really appreciate it. Of course, Linda replied warmly. You've got this. And if you ever need a pep talk, just call me. I will, Melissa promised. Talk soon? Absolutely, Linda said. Take care, Melissa. You too, Linda. Bye. They exchanged cheerful goodbyes before the call ended, leaving Melissa sitting in thoughtful silence, bracing herself for the conversation that lay ahead. Now let's see the story from Jim's side. When I walked through the door that Saturday night after an extended shift, the last thing I expected was the scene waiting for me. The smell of my favorite meal, roast beef with all the trimmings, wafted through the house. Melissa stood by the dining table, a warm smile on her face, holding a cold beer. Hey, you, she said sweetly, planting a kiss on my cheek. I blinked, surprised. Don't get me wrong, Melissa's a great cook. But this? Beer. Dinner ready? And the extra affection? It wasn't just dinner, it was a setup. My gut told me something was coming. We sat down, and for a moment, everything felt normal. I took a sip of the beer, savoring the crisp taste, but I couldn't shake the feeling of a trap. She fiddled with her napkin before speaking. Darling, she said, her voice wavering just a little. We need to talk. I put down my fork, leaning back in my chair. Sure, go ahead. Her lips pressed together as if she were bracing herself. I understand that this may be difficult for you to accept right now, but it's something I really need to do. I narrowed my eyes, trying to read between the lines. Okay, so what do you need? If this is so important to you, of course I'll do anything I can for your happiness. She smiled, relieved, it seemed, and leaned forward slightly. Good. So, we've been discussing starting a family, she said carefully, and I'm just about ready for that. There was a pause, and my heart kicked up a notch. But? I prompted, sensing the catch. She exhaled deeply. But there are still a couple of things that I feel I need to do first. I frowned. Like what? It should only be a couple of months at most. She continued quickly, then we can start working on making a few kids. I leaned forward, intrigued but cautious. That's great, baby, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. So, what are these things you need to do? Melissa fidgeted with her fingers, avoiding my gaze. I need to sow my last few wild oats, she said carefully, as if testing how the words would land. I blinked, unsure I'd heard her right. Wild oats? She nodded quickly, offering a fragile smile. It's just temporary. Then I'll be able to completely settle down and be the best wife and mother to our kids that you could possibly dream of. A knot formed in my chest as I searched her face, trying to piece together where this conversation was headed. And? I prompted, sensing there was more. She inhaled sharply, like she was preparing to dive into icy water, and then spilled it all in one breath. I'm going to be dating a few other men for a while, she said. We'll still be making love on a regular basis, but I'll also be having sex with some other guys to get everything out of my system. Keep in mind, it's only sex with the other guys. You are the only one that gets my love. My jaw clenched involuntarily, but I forced myself to stay composed. Melissa's voice softened as she hurried to reassure me. After a couple of months, I'll come back to you and be your loyal wife again, she said with conviction. Then we can start working on having the family we planned on. I took a long, deliberate gulp from my beer, letting the bitter cold liquid wash down the burning knot in my chest. Setting the bottle down with a faint clink, I leaned back in my chair, locking eyes with Melissa. It sounds like you're not asking for my permission to do this, I said evenly, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. So, I assume you've already made up your mind. She opened her mouth, probably to say something reassuring, but I lifted a hand to stop her. Now, I'm not going to remind you that you're married or that you took vows in a church forsaking all others, because clearly, that means nothing to you right now. So, I'm not going to waste my time trying to stop you. Her face flushed, a mix of nervousness and guilt flickering in her expression. She fidgeted with her fingers again, but I pressed on. Since you went to the trouble of cooking my favorite dinner and handing me a beer, I continued, it's pretty obvious that you've been planning this whole conversation for a while. And let's be real, you probably already have a list of men lined up for your fun, don't you? Melissa's lips parted in protest, but the faint flicker of guilt confirmed what I already knew. I leaned forward slightly, my tone dropping lower. So let me make this crystal clear. Officially, as your husband, I am declining your proposal to open our marriage. Her face shifted, surprise mixing with uncertainty. I am not going to be standing by, I said firmly, or giving you permission to sleep with other men. I took a steadying breath, my knuckles tightening around the neck of the beer bottle. The words tasted bitter even before I spoke them. Since you're not going to stop, I need to know how this works. Are you planning to move out? Or are you expecting me to leave? And what about the logistics here? Are you bringing them back to our home to have sex? Going to their place? A hotel? Melissa's lips curved into a small, almost hopeful smile. I figured we would both continue living here. After all, we'll still be married. And, like I said earlier, we'll continue to make love as well. The other guys will just be sex. With you, it will be making love. I raised an eyebrow but kept my mouth shut. I imagine I'd occasionally go to their place, she added casually, but I'll probably bring them back here sometimes too. On those nights, you'd need to sleep in the spare bedroom. I just don't see the point of paying for a hotel when we have this space. I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to stay calm despite the rage simmering beneath my skin. Let me be very clear, I said, my voice hard and deliberate. As long as I'm in this house, you are not bringing any man into it. If you do, you and that man will both get seriously hurt. Do I make myself clear? Her smile faltered, uncertainty creeping across her face, but I didn't care. And another thing. Since my wife apparently wants to screw half the town, I added, voice laced with disgust, I won't bother thinking about having sex with you. Who knows what disease you might be carrying and from whom. So, forget that part about us making love. Melissa's voice softened, but it didn't make her words any easier to hear. Well, Jim, she said, almost regretfully, I can't say that I'm not disappointed in that. After all, I love you and always enjoy our lovemaking, but I understand your concern. I guess I'll just have to live with it. I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. So, I asked flatly, when do you plan on starting your little flings? A flicker of excitement returned to her face, and she smiled, an expression that twisted my stomach. Well, Linda and I made plans to go out to a club and meet up with a couple of guys from work tomorrow night. I'm not sure what will happen, but I might bring one of them back here for the night. My jaw clenched, but I kept my voice even. She pressed on, unfazed by the tension. Since you aren't going to be having sex with me while I'm doing this anyway, maybe it would be best if you just moved into the spare room for the next couple of months. I stood up slowly. Don't worry about it, I said coldly. I'll make sure I moved out by the time you get home tomorrow night. Now let us check the story from Melissa's side. This was going better than I could have ever hoped. He didn't raise his voice once. Everything was said so calmly, almost like a normal conversation. I couldn't believe how mature he was handling it. My heart swelled with happiness. Sure, he had expressed a small complaint and was refusing to have sex with me, but he was completely accepting of everything. He wasn't angry at all. Linda must be right. Jim would come to accept the new dynamics, and within 2 months, he'd be under my control. I knew his refusal for sex was only temporary. After a week or two, he'd be back in my bed, and I'd dangle it like a carrot to make him do my bidding. Next afternoon, I called Linda. Hi, Linda. It's Melissa. Tell me, how did it go last night? Did he react with anger? I leaned back in my chair, letting out a sigh of relief. I couldn't believe how smoothly things had gone with Jim. He was far more composed than I had ever imagined he'd be. After all the build-up and anticipation of what was going to happen, the reality of it turned out to be almost easy. Yeah, I was so surprised, I said, rolling my eyes even though I was alone. It was like talking to a different person. He was calm, logical, and even told me he wanted me to be happy, just not with someone else in our bed. Linda laughed lightly on the other end of the phone. Oh, Jim. Always the gentleman, even when he has every reason not to be. You're lucky, you know? Most guys would have blown up right in your face. I smiled. I know, right? I thought for sure he would throw a fit. But it wasn't like that. We talked about it, and I was honest with him. He didn't seem thrilled, but he wasn't angry. I think he's processing it all still, trying to figure out how he feels. Well, that's good. I mean, I was hoping he'd be a little more understanding than you thought, but it sounds like he's going to come around. Maybe not now, but eventually. I hope so. But I told him that I wasn't going to expect him to just fall in line right away. He needs time to figure it out, and I'll give him that. I want him to have the space to decide on his own terms, not feel pushed into anything. Exactly. You can't force someone into that mindset, especially if they haven't been exposed to it before. Let him take his time, and if he's still on board, then maybe things will shift. Yeah, he did say something interesting last night, I added. He said he'd be refusing to have sex with me while I'm with someone else. I don't know if he meant it as a challenge or if he's actually serious about it, but I'm not going to push him on it. If he wants to take a step back, I'm not going to argue. Linda's voice softened with understanding. That's definitely a tough one. But you know, it might just be his way of asserting some control in a situation where he feels a little helpless. The more time he has to think it over, the more likely he'll come to terms with it. Yeah, I get that. I know he's feeling vulnerable, and it's tough for him to process. He's used to things being a certain way with us, and now, all of a sudden, it's different. I can't expect him to just jump into it with both feet. Linda paused for a moment before speaking again. You know, it's funny. I bet after a week or two of him using his hand while knowing there's a beautiful woman available right beside him, he'll be right back. I couldn't help but chuckle at that, even though I knew she might be onto something. Yeah, maybe. He's always been a bit of a creature of habit. It's like once the reality sets in, he might just find it harder to resist than he thinks. We laughed. Let's meet at the club at 7, Linda said, and we hung up. I couldn't help but feel a little thrill as I hung up the phone with Linda. There was something about the way things were unfolding that gave me a sense of power and control, and it was intoxicating. Jim, refusing to touch me? Fine. I wasn't going to play by the rules he thought he could set. I stood up, glancing toward the door as I heard him moving around in the spare room. I could hear him shuffling boxes and clothes, packing up everything he was taking with him. It felt like we were on the verge of something new, even though it wasn't exactly what I'd expected. Jim, I called out, stepping into the hallway. I glanced over at Jim as he finished sealing up the last box. His back was turned, and I couldn't help but feel a little detached. It wasn't a bad feeling, but it was strange. The house, our shared space, was already starting to feel like something else, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. I had to admit, though, that his calmness in all this made it easier for me to move on. Maybe he was better at handling this kind of change than I had thought. I stood in front of the full-length mirror by the door, adjusting the straps of my dress, admiring the way it hugged my curves. I hadn't worn this dress in a year, but I always knew it made me feel incredible. There was something liberating about slipping it on tonight. As much as I was letting go of things with Jim, I was also stepping into something new for myself. Okay, Jim. I'm leaving, I said, my voice light, but with a hint of finality. I'll probably be back around 1 in the morning, so you don't need to wait up for me. Besides, I probably won't be alone. He glanced up, his face softening for just a second as he finished taping up the last box. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll be moved out by then. I smirked, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. This was all happening so fast, but I was ready for it. Jim would be gone by the time I came back, and I had plans that didn't involve him. Good, I said, giving him a little nod, then turning toward the door. Take care of yourself, Jim. Goodbye, Melissa, he murmured, not looking up but his voice carrying a hint of something unspoken. I gave him one last glance, then stepped out the door, shutting it quietly behind me. As the sound of the door click faded, I couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom wash over me. I was walking away from the past and into a future that I was ready to define for myself. I was at the bar with Linda, Logan, and Brian, feeling the buzz of the night. Logan and Brian are both good-looking account managers at work, and I've heard the office whispers. They're really good in bed. While Jim's great, I'm curious to try something new. Linda asks, so, Jim really moved completely into the spare bedroom? Yeah, I reply. He promised to be out by the time I got back. Brian raises an eyebrow. That's what he said? Yep, I smirk. He said, I will be moved out by then. We all laugh. Logan jokes, I was hoping we could just make the little cuck move over, so we could do it on the bed right beside him. I laugh, adding, maybe after I work on him for a week or two. Then, I glance at Brian and Logan. But first, why haven't either of you asked me to dance yet? Brian smirks and gets up, followed by Logan. I join them on the dance floor, the music pulsing around us. I dance with both, feeling the tension rise as the night goes on. I took Brian home, and Linda took Logan. The house was dark when we walked in, which meant Jim was probably already in bed. That's fine. We didn't need him to watch tonight. I led Brian down the hall and into my room. Sure enough, Jim's stuff was gone. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction at that. He was officially out. Maybe I'd cook him something nice tomorrow to reward him for at least sticking to his word. But for now, I had other things on my mind. Brian and I had wild sex, and once we were done, he had to leave to get back to his wife and kids. I threw on my robe and went to make coffee, feeling a little disappointed when I saw Jim hadn't made it. It was after 9 o'clock, after all. He usually had everything ready by now. I should have had coffee and breakfast waiting for me after such a late night. I'd have to talk to him about that later. Honestly, was it so hard to do something nice for me? So much for the food I was going to cook for him. I grabbed a bagel for breakfast and then jumped in the shower. With nothing planned for the day, I went for an old pair of shorts and a t-shirt. I was just finishing up tying my hair into a ponytail when my phone rang. Hey, Mel. I saw it was Linda calling. Hey, you. So, how was Brian last night? I asked, curious. He was amazing. Everything I expected. Linda sounded pleased. And how did Jim react this morning? She inquired. I'm not sure. I'm a little annoyed, honestly. He's still sleeping in, and I was hoping he'd be up, making me breakfast and coffee. I was even thinking about rewarding him for getting moved to the spare room, but not anymore. Linda chuckled. Yeah? Let him know you're disappointed and make it clear what you expect moving forward. Stay firm with him, but also remember to give him small rewards when he does something right. That way, he'll have some incentive to do better. In fact, I will go to his room right now and order him to make breakfast for me. I was fuming as I marched to his room. I opened the door and I stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, staring at the emptiness. His clothes were gone. The tools that had been scattered around the room were no longer there. It hit me. He really did move out, not to the other room, but out of the house. Oh, hell, I shouted, as panic started to rise in my chest. What's wrong? Linda's voice crackled through the phone, her concern immediate. Jim's not in the spare bedroom. His clothes aren't even in the closet. Hold on. I couldn't believe it. I was already running through the house, my footsteps heavy as I checked the living room, the kitchen, anything. The reality was sinking in. He was gone. Shit. His truck's gone. His tools are gone too. That small, nagging feeling I had in the back of my mind? It was taking shape, becoming clearer by the second. Oh no, I whispered to myself. This can't be happening. What? What is it? Mary's voice echoed in my head, frantic as I was. Jim moved out. He's gone. I understand now. He never said he'd move his stuff to the spare room. He said he was moving his stuff out of my room, but I thought he meant just the room, not the entire house. He said he'd be out before I got back, but I thought it was just about that damn room. Linda's voice was calm, but firm, like she had an answer that would make everything better. No, no, no. That's the wrong thing to do. You don't call him. You don't give him that power. That just shows him weakness. You let him come crawling back to you. Give it a couple of days, and he'll be begging to return. He's just throwing a little tantrum right now. Trust me, this is actually a good thing. You've got leverage now. I could feel my heart beating faster, the anger building as I paced around the house. Her words rang in my head, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for the advice she was offering. You're sure? Really? She chuckled softly, a knowing tone in her voice. Of course I'm sure. Look at what my husband does for me. You're in control, Melissa. This speeds things up. Trust me. You don't need to chase him. Let him come to you. It sounded harsh, but a part of me couldn't deny that she was right. If he was willing to walk out, then maybe it was time for me to play it cool. Time to make him realize just how much he was going to lose. Well, I said, my voice a little softer now. I have to admit that you've been right so far. Linda had a way of making everything sound easy, like I could just sit back and let Jim come crawling back. But deep down, I was scared. I did love Jim. He wasn't just some pawn in a game, and the thought of him leaving, it stung. Yet, there was this part of me, this part Linda had awakened, that thought maybe an open marriage could be the answer. It could be the perfect mix of security and freedom. I wanted to have it all, the stability of Jim, his loyalty, his submission, but also the excitement of being with other men. I could eventually settle back down, but why not have my fun for a while? Linda made it sound so effortless. She seemed to have it all figured out, and I wondered if I could too. But I also knew that I needed some time to myself. I'd been on edge all day, running through every possible scenario in my mind, and I needed to unwind. Tomorrow, I'd meet Brian at work for our session, and that thought made me smile. The idea of him, his energy, his confidence, it was the perfect distraction. With that in mind, I made myself a simple dinner. Nothing fancy, just something to fill the emptiness gnawing at me. I poured myself a glass of wine, the rich taste easing the tension in my shoulders. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to just enjoy the evening without thinking about everything else. After cleaning up, I went to bed, the sheets cool against my skin. I tried to relax, but my mind kept racing. What if Jim didn't come back? What if this really was it? I sighed, pushing those thoughts away. Tomorrow would be another day. It had been 2 days since I last heard from Jim, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept telling myself it wasn't that unexpected. After all, Linda had reassured me that I'd hear from him soon. She even said the longer he stayed away, the more I'd be able to control the situation. In a twisted way, that thought brought me comfort. Maybe Jim just needed time to come to his senses and realize what he was missing. Or maybe he was testing me. Whatever it was, Linda was adamant that it wasn't anything to worry about. In the meantime, I had been keeping myself busy. After work, I met up with Logan, Brian, and a couple of other guys. They were all charming, confident, and fun to be around. They made me forget, even if just for a few hours, about the anxiety creeping in the back of my mind. I took them home, had an orgy, and it went almost all night long. But every time they left, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that Jim was still missing. It was the third day now, and I still hadn't heard from him. I felt the weight of the silence. Was he ever going to come back? What if he didn't? What if this was it? I was starting to feel a little panicked, but I pushed the worry aside, telling myself Linda was right. She had been through this, and she knew what she was talking about. By the 5th day, all hell broke loose. It was mid-morning on Friday, and we were all gathered around the coffee maker, casually chatting during our break. The conversation was lighthearted, with Linda laughing at something Brian had said, when we noticed a woman approaching. She was younger, maybe in her late 20s, and looked very put together, professionally dressed, with a look that made her stand out. "Melissa Parker, Linda Morgan, Brian Powers, and Logan Smith?" she asked, her southern drawl soft but clear. We all nodded and identified ourselves, confused as to why this woman was addressing us. Without another word, she handed each of us an envelope. I was about to ask what it was when she snapped a quick picture of us with a small digital camera. "Y'all have been served," she said, turning on her heel and making her way toward our boss's office without a single glance back. I stared after her, still holding the envelope. "What's this?" I called, hoping she'd give me some explanation. She just smiled and walked right into our boss's office without knocking, and within less than a minute, she emerged, still smiling brightly. "Y'all have a nice day, now," she said, her tone almost cheerful as she exited the building, leaving us standing there, more confused than ever. We all hesitated for a second before simultaneously opening our envelopes. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words printed across the front of the paper. "Petition for the dissolution of marriage." What the hell? My eyes started to skim the document, and when I saw the words adultery listed as the cause, I almost collapsed. My hand trembled slightly as I read further, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. This couldn't be happening. Before I could process what I was holding, I heard Brian and Logan's phones ring. They both pulled their phones from their pockets and glanced down at the screens, their expressions immediately shifting. "Oh hell," they whispered under their breath, both of them clearly seeing something that made their faces go pale. It didn't take long for us to piece together what had just happened. Brian and Logan were both glued to their phones, I could guess. It was probably about their wives getting the evidence of their affairs, and now their homes were about to be turned upside down. "Shit, what the hell?" Brian muttered, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. Logan didn't even respond, just staring at his screen in disbelief. I couldn't believe what was happening. One moment, everything was normal. The next, we were all holding divorce papers, and the men around me were about to lose their homes and marriages, just like that. Then came a bellow from inside the boss's office. "What the hell?" I jumped, startled by the outburst. A moment later, our boss stormed out of his office, his face red with fury. His eyes locked on us as he roared across the room, his voice carrying throughout the entire office. "You guys get in here, right now?" I froze. I knew this wasn't good. There was no way it could be. We didn't even need to exchange words. There was no time. Heads down, we all shuffled toward his office, each of us wondering what fresh hell awaited us inside. As I passed by him, I saw his fiery gaze following each of us as we entered. As soon as the door slammed shut behind us, I felt it. A sharp, sickening feeling deep in my stomach. Bad doesn't even begin to cover it. The boss was furious. "Well, can any of you brainless morons confirm for me that, at the very least, none of this shit happened on company time and on company property?" he barked. Apparently, the company is being sued for not enforcing the moral code we have in our employee handbook. Any idea why someone would want to do that? None of us spoke. "Well then, I will explain it to you then. We are being sued because apparently, Mrs. Melissa Parker can't seem to keep her legs closed. Mr. Smith and Mr. Powers can't seem to keep their mojo inside their pants, and Mrs. Linda Morgan has decided to play the main madam of the brothel. Now, would any of you dimwits be so kind as to assure me that any of these claims are invalid?" Again, no one spoke. He screamed, "You guys better start praying it doesn't all come crashing down, because if it does, you guys can kiss your whole career goodbye." We all walked out of the room. What was I doing? I had spent days convincing myself that I was in control, that this whole open marriage thing was just a way to have more fun, to feel liberated. I had convinced myself that Jim would eventually cave, that he'd come crawling back when he realized I was the one who held all the power. But now, as I stood here in the silence, holding my phone in my hand like a lifeline, it hit me. This wasn't fun. This wasn't power. This was a mess. And I had no idea how to fix it. My heart was racing as I scrolled through the list of names in my contacts, each one a potential lead that could help me find Jim. But with every call I made, each person I reached out to, the same cold silence greeted me. No one had heard from him. No one knew where he was. "God damn it," I muttered, frustration and panic mixing together. I gripped my phone so tightly that my fingers started to ache. Was he really gone for good? Why was he shutting me out like this? I tried to call a few of his closest friends, guys he'd gone on countless camping trips with, played poker with, even grabbed drinks with after work. They'd always been in constant contact, so surely one of them would have known something. But no, not a damn thing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What if he was really done with me? What if this was his way of telling me that he was finished? "Melissa, calm down," I whispered to myself, trying to regain some control. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't me. This wasn't the woman who had it all under control. I ran my fingers through my hair, the sense of helplessness overwhelming me. How had things escalated so quickly? Just days ago, I was calling the shots, making plans to have him crawl back to me. But now, I was the one searching desperately, hoping to find him before it was too late. I sat back, staring at the list of names again. There had to be someone who knew where Jim had gone, someone who had heard from him. But still, no one knew where he was. I had become the person who pushed too hard, who assumed too much, and now I was paying the price. The thought of Jim, the man I had promised to be with forever, out there somewhere and not even taking my calls, it twisted my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I might have ruined everything. I couldn't even bring myself to be angry anymore, only desperate. The tables had turned, all right, but not in the way I thought. It wasn't Jim who was going to beg and grovel. It was me. I was the one who had miscalculated everything, and now I was the one scrambling to fix it. Any guesses at who would be begging and groveling now? I stood there in the office lobby, feeling the weight of the situation settle on my shoulders. I had no plan, no direction. Monday morning, I went to Jim's office. Jim was nowhere to be found. The lady in the front desk said, "He is on leave for the next 2 weeks." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stand there. She barely even glanced up when I asked about Jim. I went back to my office. The boss's glare as I walked past wasn't helping either. What did he want me to do? I was late, yes, but I couldn't even pretend like I cared about being on time at that moment. I couldn't reach Jim, not through any means, and his friends had all turned their backs on me. Even if I wanted to show up at his doorstep, I had no idea where he was anymore. The thought of standing on his doorstep, knocking and hoping for some kind of response, was both humiliating and hopeless. But I was willing to do it. Everything had been spiraling out of control, but then Linda's news came up. I couldn't believe it at first. Linda, always so confident, always in control, was now on the street. Mark had served her with divorce papers. But the worst part was how it all went down. Apparently, he found out about her affairs and completely lost it. He wasn't the weak, submissive husband she had always made him out to be. No, Mark wasn't going to take it. When he found out, he didn't hesitate. He kicked her out, literally kicked her out onto the street. I wasn't sure what to feel. Relief that it wasn't me, guilt for what Linda had done, or fear that my own fate was going to be just as harsh. But Linda deserved to be dumped on the street for lying to me. And then, it got worse. Much worse. The boss called me into his office, his expression grim. "Melissa, you and Linda are under investigation," he said, like it was some kind of routine. "The men have been fired, but you two, well, you're different." He didn't need to say it. I knew exactly what he meant. Being women, we weren't being treated the same. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was how far I had fallen. I never imagined it would come to this. In court, they showed everything. All the videos, all the images, everything I had done, laid out for everyone to see. My heart sank as I watched, powerless to stop it. There was no defense, no justification that would make it right. I could barely even look at myself on that screen. I was broken, exposed, and all I could do was sit there as the evidence piled up against me. I had nothing left. There was no way to fight it. It was over. 3 months later, the divorce was final. I wasn't expecting much. After all, I had a good job, and there wasn't anything to split. There was no alimony, no spousal support, no joint accounts to divide. The house was leased, so I didn't even have to deal with that. But still, the emptiness of it all crushed me. I cried for days, the kind of tears that seemed endless, like they might just wash away everything I had ever known. Eventually, I had to return to my office. I couldn't avoid it forever. As soon as I walked through the door, I was called into the boss's office. I didn't know what to expect, but I sure wasn't ready for what happened next. When I walked in, he was sitting behind his desk, that damn smile on his face. The kind of smile that made my skin crawl. He handed me an envelope, and the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something, made my stomach twist. It didn't take long to realize what was inside. My walking papers. He'd fired me. Maybe it was inevitable after everything that had gone down. The scandal, the public humiliation, the legal mess. But somehow, seeing him smiling as he handed me the envelope, like he enjoyed it, made it all feel worse. Like I had lost, and he was savoring it. I stared at him, unable to speak. He didn't say much either, just sat there with that damn smile, as if he was waiting for some kind of reaction. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. It wasn't until 2 days later that the truth finally hit me. It was Jim who made a deal with the company. Apparently, he'd worked out some agreement that I wouldn't be fired until his divorce was finalized. If I was let go before then, he would have been on the hook for paying me something. But now, he wasn't liable for anything. I sat there, stunned, processing the fact that Jim had been playing his own game all along. I was left with nothing. No job, no husband, no lover. Brian and Logan, the ones I'd thought I could lean on for support, were both drained by their own divorces, barely in any condition to offer help. Linda, too, was fired along with me. The chaos, the mess, it all came back to one thing. We were pawns, each of us, in a game where the rules were set by the people who had the power. And now, it felt like it was all over. Our husbands got what they wanted. Revenge. It wasn't justice or even closure. It was just cold, calculated revenge. And we were left to pick up the pieces of everything they tore apart. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.